Story 1. Most people are living paycheck to paycheck and cannot afford to lose their jobs by participating in any kind of strike or protest. This is most definitely by design. You do not have to worry about the working class fighting back if they are all too exhausted, ill, and occupied to do anything. Story 2. I don't blame the Americans for not protesting as violently as you would expect. They are like the frog in the pot that has been slowly heating up over time until it started boiling. There are protests and they are gaining popularity. I think the Americans just need a minute to breathe after being winded. I believe they will protest. Story 3. There's protests happening all over the country. I never understood why this question is asked so often. People are constantly mobilizing and organizing. Even when some of the worst expressions of United States state power, like the counterintelligence program, was happening, it just had a huge adverse effect of turning reformists to more radical positions, from Angela Davis to George Jackson. John Kennedy's and Lyndon Johnson's Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara said 3 decades later about the counterintelligence program, "I have grown sick at heart witnessing the cynicism and even contempt with which so many people view our political institutions and leaders. We were wrong, terribly wrong. The pushback is real when events like this happen. From Ferguson to George Floyd, people have massive pushback." Story 4. There's a mass protest scheduled for February 5th across multiple cities and time zones. There were big protests in Washington, D.C. the week of the inauguration as well. I went to look up the date to confirm. There are so many planned protests I struggled to find what I was looking for. There's a protest on the 3rd by all immigrants, and there seem to be scattered protests on the 4th for a number of reasons. Federal government workers seem to be the biggest group, and the big multi-city one is indeed on the 5th. I am sleepy. I misremembered the date. I saw a bunch of flyers on Facebook earlier today. Story 5. There have been some, but remember, half of America wanted this and are supportive of it. There will not be any real protests from that half until they are personally affected, when it is too late. Someday soon, they are going to show a baby being ripped from the arms of an immigrant mother who knows she will never see her child again. Half of America will be appalled and half is going to cheer. These are not normal people with normal human feelings. Story 6. There have been protests, they just don't get a whole lot of coverage. The inauguration protest, obviously, and in California there were some protests. I think collectively, the American people are waiting to see what our representatives are going to do. Trump is issuing a bunch of executive orders that are illegal and will get knocked down by the courts, but those processes take time. I think there is also a real fear of how Trump will respond to protests before Congress or courts check him. It's a tense moment in our history, but we don't really have a grasp on the situation yet. People on Reddit are anxious, but they are always anxious. Most people don't really know how the process works, but so far, no one has really called for protests. Our representatives are instead trying to advocate for communicating to our representatives in Congress and applying pressure that way. This isn't the first time executive orders have been made that are illegal and probably won't be the last. Until either a congressperson calls on the people to protest or the court allows Trump to keep doing this, you most likely won't see massive protests. Story 7. I don't think you understand what people are currently going through at the moment. I have $17 in my bank account. My cat is actively dying in front of my eyes, and I can't do anything about it. I'm sure so many of us are going through similarly tragic things right now. Story 8. Reddit is still out of touch. I watched almost every liberal mainstream media coverage of the election results, mainly because I love how every one of them thought Kamala was going to win, and then they started making excuses when she didn't, and the talking points are all the same. Out of touch with the average voter, and that's why you lost. I'm moving. I'm not talking to any Republican again. I'm abstaining from dating or having sex with men. People aren't ready for a woman president. Being black hurt her. She didn't have enough time. It's nauseating how many excuses the Democratic Party comes up with. Understand that the United States overwhelmingly supported and voted for Donald Trump and rejected Kamala and her policies. If you want to continue your excuses, the needle will continue to move to the conservative side. For the love of God, learn from your loss. Acting like you have superior morals and the high ground only made your fall that much worse. I have to say, it was nice to watch over and over on the news. Story 9. Modern Americans who enjoy the idea of resistance don't actually enjoy the act of being in a resistance. That's why half of AskReddit posts right now are just vent posts about politics. People are just looking for others to suffer with because they're addicted to a community of suffering individuals who are, in reality, too weak to actually do anything about it. Story 10. Plenty of protests and resistance here in Seattle. The problem is that it's Seattle. Of course, Seattle is going to protest, but it isn't going to affect the rest of the country. Story 11. 70% of eligible United States voters either voted for Trump or did not vote at all. The overwhelming majority of Americans either want this or do not care at all. Story 12. What protest? Everything going on is exactly as promised in the huge Project 2025 blueprint. This is what people voted for. Same as Brexit, a lot of people voted for something, and after the exit, now the light goes on, and the regrets and recriminations begin. Story 13. Americans voted him in huge numbers across the country, so Americans are at home on the couch smiling. The echo chamber on the internet is not how the mass population of America feels about Trump. Story 14. Where am I going to protest? I'm from Oregon. There aren't any effective ways of protesting the federal government because their control is from the East Coast. I've gone to marches here, but that's sort of expected at this point. It doesn't get much coverage, and I doubt any on the East Coast. Story 15. There are a lot of protests happening, they're just not being shown on mainstream media, I guess. There have been many everywhere, even in the South. The most recent one happened in St. Louis, Missouri. Why do you all act like social media is a reflection of everything happening right now? Story 16. I'll try to explain this the best I can. There are several reasons you don't see us protesting like Europeans and in other countries. Our society is far too capitalist. We work to live and live to work. We are not able to take a day or 2 or 3 off to protest. We risk losing our jobs, which are tied to our health care, retirement, and so on. Employers would and could fire us for doing so. There are more people than jobs, and nobody is expendable. After the Vietnam War, when the United States saw its largest protests in history, our large community gathering spaces slowly disappeared. Unless you go to your local downtown area and plan for disrupting the entire community, it just isn't happening. The United States is huge. When we do protest, they are small protests in a few states. Nothing really huge. You will see marches on the Mall in Washington, D.C., but rarely a large-scale protest. Currently, we know that if we plan massive protests, the former president will declare martial law and attempt to use our own military on us, and then we are well and truly done for. He's done it before, and he's essentially eager to do it again. There are likely many service members who will remember the oath they took to our Constitution, but there are also many in our military who believe as this administration does, and are eager to commit violence against the liberals. I hope this helps. I may have missed some other reasons, but these are the ones that come to my mind. I might add that over half of us did not vote for this mess. Our hands are essentially tied, and there isn't a lot we can do. I'm a registered Democrat and have been for 40 years. My party sold us down the river, and none of us know why they are, to date, neglecting to uphold the Constitution and the voters who gave them power. Story 17. They are scheduled. Stop listening to the Russian robots saying, Americans today do not care, nobody has energy, and the like. Never assume someone is who they claim online. Story 18. Dude, we're tired. We did resistance for years, only to see that Democrats are useless and our neighbors wanted this nonsense again. A lot of us are okay with tuning out, focusing on our own lives, and letting these fools reap the whirlwind until the next election. Story 19. Most of the civilized world does not understand that one of the major issues is that Americans are rightfully scared to violently protest because our police force is militarized and has the capability to absolutely brutalize and exterminate its own citizens. Also, there are a lot of protests happening, and there is a lot of organization occurring as well. Mainstream media is mostly owned by billionaires now, and the current protests are being fully suppressed. That being said, it is also very hard when a large part of the population is embracing tyranny and happily voted for it. Lastly, I just do not think people understand the size, scope, and separation within the United States. Most states operate and act independently and are the size of European countries. People do not understand that on a societal level, the United States is much more like the European Union than a single country. Most of the protests are localized, which is why you are not hearing much, but what needs to happen is more marches on Washington, District of Columbia. The problem is that millions of Americans who are most affected are in impoverished areas and are unable to afford to travel or stop working and cannot organize in any significant way in their current locations. Story 20. People legitimately voted for the idiot, and this time he didn't lose the popular vote by millions like last time. But the problem isn't just the idiot in chief. It's the very rich running the country into the ground to make another dollar. Story 21. Half of us voted for Trump. We didn't rebel against the previous president because that isn't how this country works. That being said, some of us actually like what Trump is doing, and things are finally being done. Story 22. Too many Americans are apathetic and disillusioned, and it is going to take nationwide suffering, such as loss of jobs, loss of loved ones, and going hungry, for America to finally do something. Story 23. There are actually a fair number of protests. They are just not gaining traction in the media, and they are not as big as when Donald Trump got elected the first time. Story 24. The vocal majority on Reddit is actually the minority opinion in the country. This website is an echo chamber, so you cannot get the answer you want here. Story 25. Did you read about Stonewall? Did you see Black Lives Matter? Did you see the Me Too movement? These are all different, but we're not finished. What a strange question to ask. We wanted a peaceful transition of an administrator, and like it or not, we got it. I have my voice on the grassroots level, but you make it sound like we're sleeping. Story 26. They haven't felt it yet. Yes, those of us with half a brain see it, and we know it's terrible and it will get worse, but nobody has felt it enough yet. We have to go to work to be able to pay our bills and to have our health insurance, and since we're either at work or exhausted from work, we just don't have the energy to invest in something that isn't affecting us. Combine that with the protests that have been either small or peaceful or both. Those don't make newsworthy events or generate clicks, even if the news wanted to defy their overlords. In my opinion, give it time. Trump and Elon Musk will continue ripping the United States apart, and eventually the people with their heads in the sand will start to feel it. That is when the protests will begin, and not the nice ones. That is when we'll see if the military will blindly follow orders as some rich dude's personal army to quell dissenters, or if they'll stand by their oath to the Constitution. Unfortunately, because the people within the government who could stand up to this are choosing not to, things are going to have to get a lot worse before they can get better. Story 27. Too busy struggling day to day. That's how the oligarchy, which has been propping up Democrats and Republicans for so very long, has made themselves safe. Exhausting the will of the poor and ensuring their ignorance has been on purpose and building up to now for decades. Story 28. The bread and butter issues are what drive most people in voting. Can I find a job? How expensive are my groceries? How are my retirement savings doing? Despite a lot of the sensational headlines, there is still a lot of let's wait and see how this will actually affect me down the road. If the recent tariffs lead to spikes in inflation, there will surely be more protests stemming from that. Story 29. Well, there's the 50-51 protests that are happening Wednesday. There's the Californian independent movement along with two New England ones, the New England Autonomous Movement and the Republic of New England. So stuff is happening. Give it time for people to realize that the next 4 years and beyond are not going to be good. Story 30. One issue most people don't recognize in both Europe and America is the issue of geography. Most people don't live near where the decision makers live. It's easier to protest and revolt when the country you live in is a glorified city-state. Most Americans are nowhere near the people who are making choices for them. Their capital city was built in a swamp for a reason. Story 31. I'm at work. That's why there will never be a revolution in the United States again. We're all working our asses off to survive. I'm tired all the time. I don't have the time or the energy to be in the streets anymore. I just want to get 8 hours of sleep before I wake up to grind for 12 more. Story 32. Americans' faith in the law is dead. The Supreme Court says Trump can do whatever he wants. Their faith in law enforcement is dead. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is being told they'll be fired if they don't side with Trump. Their faith in the military has long been dead. They have sided with tyrants and committed atrocities, whether they were led by red or blue leaders. Their faith in the vote is dead. If things aren't gerrymandered, then the public is made so stupid that they vote in the worst possible leaders anyway. Their faith in protest, peaceful or otherwise, is dead. They did that for Black Lives Matter. They did that against Trump his first term. The whole world marched on Women's Day. Y'all remember that? It was the biggest protest the world ever saw. They reversed abortion law anyway. Americans aren't protesting because everything they believed that made protests worthwhile has died. What else is left? Protest is merely the first form of resistance. The Americans are going quiet, but they aren't going blind. Their lives are under threat, but their voices are merely hushed in quiet corners, in grassroots basements, hidden from Big Brother's ears, and yours as well. But that quiet silence should speak volumes about the sentiment here. The conversation has merely begun, and when the shouting begins, it will be disruptive and violent and hard, but it will not be in apathy or despair. Heroes will rise up, anger will fuel the flames, and those with the resources to do so will support where they can. Listen carefully. You may yet hear them whispering in the dark, the light of hope flickering behind raging eyes, staring down the barrel of rebellion.